All right. So we are going to talk about a challenge that a lot of coaches and athletes face throughout their competitive seasons. Specifically, in this case, we're going to talk about the CrossFit season, but this is somewhat applicable across broad modal domains, right? Is that what's the broad time in modal domains? Is that what CrossFit says?
Yeah.
Something like that. Anyway, I did just get my updated, renewed L3 certificate in the mail recently. Signed by Rosa himself. So I'm, an expert in all things CrossFit, according to that, which I, sitting right there. I'm going to frame it, and maybe it'll be on the wall behind us next time we pod. John, what do you think?
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Anyway, so something that's challenging is keeping the goal, right? This is something that is sort of floated around a lot of coaching circles for a while, and in sports where you have a lot of different things that give you numbers, metrics, wins, losses, whatever that you're being evaluated on, it's difficult for motivated, metric-driven people to keep the big picture goal, the goal, when they're getting these little pieces of feedback along the way sometimes, right? So we've talked in the past about how it's dangerous to not compete enough because you never really know where you sit, and how some people compete too much and they're always getting these like hits of competition, whatever. But from sort of a zoomed out perspective, it can be challenging to go through something like the open, quarterfinals, semifinals, games process for athletes, especially now that the open doesn't really quote unquote matter as much, where, you do the open and you don't finish as well as you like. And you're like, oh no, I've like screwed up. I am not as fit as I want to be. I'm falling behind. I'm not making progress. All these sort of negative thoughts. Whereas the goal is potentially to do particularly well in the quarterfinals and make it to semifinals, or the goal is to do well in semifinals and have a shot at making it to the games, right? And so, as a coach, it can be challenging to kind of try to pull back and be like, hey, we're trying to focus on this, which means we have to make sacrifices here. And as an athlete, I think a lot of athletes sort of understand these things, but that doesn't always necessarily translate into emotionally feeling them when you do have a performance that maybe isn't up to snuff compared to where you want. So, John, what do you think about the structure of the current game season and how it relates to this?
I mean, I think it's obviously there have been a lot of changes in the last 5 years. If we go back 5 years and look at the Open, when you had to finish, top 60 or top 40 or whatever the numbers were, to get to regionals, and at the time you look at it and say, okay, well, the top kind of 20 athletes in the world, they don't need to worry about the Open. They can do the workouts once, they can kind of do their normal thing. They're good enough that they're going to get to regionals fine. Everyone else is, okay, we're repeating this workout, we're planning our week around getting the most out of this one performance. And that was very much the kind of attitude that people had 5 years ago. Now, with the Open and quarterfinals and the amount of people that get to quarterfinals, we're starting to see, I think, a shift away from that. So, like in North America, I think it's something around the top 6,000 to 7,000 men and women qualify for quarterfinals. That's approximate. It's the top 10%, which is a huge amount of people. And when you're consistently, top 500 in the world in the Open, you don't have to worry about the Open anymore. And really, Open and quarterfinals has kind of become a two-part Open in the way it's structured. So last year, there were 4 scores. This year, there were 3 scores. And this year very much seems to be the Open is a pre-qualifier to say, yeah, you have some kind of capacity, you have some kind of ability, you're going to be fine at quarterfinals. There was nothing really testing in the Open, like 15 bar muscle ups and 15 thrusters at 135/95. Like that was about the extent of the test in the Open, outside of, do you do CrossFit to a relatively high level, right? So we've definitely taken a shift in the season, whereby what the attitude people had towards the Open 5 years ago is now more the attitude people have to quarterfinals. And even for some of those people, the margins are big enough for the amount of people that go to semifinals that they don't have to focus on it. It's not something people can take lightly, but you take those top games athletes, they're not concerned about the quarterfinals. They're not thinking about it. They're not considering it. They're just, again, going to throw it in. You look at this year, Tia and Mel basically just dominated the women's field. The men's field was a little more varied, but, they came out something like 7 and 11 points or something like that. They're not thinking about quarterfinals. They're probably not thinking too much about semifinals. They're focused on the games. But I think the season changes have now made it so that most people who are good athletes aren't concerned about the Open. And those people that are perennial, old regionals athletes aren't too concerned about quarterfinals. On the understanding that if you don't really have a major hole, you're going to be okay. You can get by with just being very good at everything without excelling in any area.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true from the structure of the season perspective, where it's like, if you have historically been a competitor at that level, there's really not a lot of things that can happen that could prevent you from finishing in the top 10% in the Open. But that doesn't mean that people don't react badly to not being near the top of something, right? That they think that they should be at the top and they're upset when they're not, right? Which is valid. And, you understand where that comes from. But I think that can create some challenges in terms of like training and preparing for something. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have people who are used to finishing, top 100, top 200, top 300 in the world in the Open because they've put all this effort into it. And now they're finishing, 500th or 1,000th. And it's like, well, I'm way off the pace this year. And it's like, no, you're not focused on this right now. You shouldn't be focused on this right now. And again, if you're like a semi-decent athlete, the first step of the Open is really just the equivalent of writing your name at the top of a test. Okay, you can do this. You've done this before. You just have to do what you normally do and you'll be fine.
I do think that something that is maybe like a more valid interpretation of the, let's say, like emotional tumultuousness that can coincide with something like the Open, right? I mean, you use the analogy of like, it's just like writing your name at the top of the test. As someone who is currently in school and is like taking a lot of tests, a common thing that can happen is that you can feel like you actually understand the material very well in your class. You actually prepared very well for the test. You feel good about the previous homework assignments and quizzes. And especially in a program where the instructors are like trying to keep the median score like relatively low, that they don't want people like getting 90% on everything, they give you stuff that you just haven't seen before on the exam. Mm-hmm. And you can feel like you know what you're doing and feel pretty good about it and just get something where you're like, I have no idea. Like, I've literally never seen this before. I don't know what this is. And I'm under time pressure and I'm not going to be able to like learn this and figure it out in the 10 minutes that I have to work on this problem. And that feels like shit, right? It's like very stressful and it feels awful. And it feels like even though you worked hard and you learned the material, that you don't actually know what you're doing, right? Like you feel exposed. And so I think that potentially the negative reaction that people have to not performing as well as they want to in the Open maybe comes down to something like that, right? Where it's like, listen, I know this isn't the priority, but I feel like I should still be able to do pretty well on whatever this wall climb, dumbbell snatch, box jump over workout. And I didn't perform where I feel like I should relative to the field. So I feel like I now have a weakness that I was exposed on and I need to work on. Right. And I think that to me seems like a more valid interpretation of what's going on there. Even though that might be expressed as like, oh my God, I'm not in shape. Like, what's wrong?
Yeah. And I think being able to maintain that perspective is important for people. And, just a singular test doesn't necessarily define your abilities. You can look back to last year's quarterfinals where there was the GHD pistol rope climb workout, which, it definitely
that workout exposed a lot of people. That exposed a lot of people. We were like, oh wow.
Yeah,
I thought I could do GHD sit-ups. I thought I could do pistols, but I can't do this.
Yeah, I as a coach don't like programming GHDs because I don't think it's a good movement. So before last year, people I was coaching would have done GHDs maybe 3 or 4 times in the 3 months leading up to that competition. It just wasn't something I liked to program for people. And again, there can be that kind of hindrance of, well, yeah, you can't just like cheat your way through GHD sit-ups. There's an element of muscular fatigue that if you don't do them frequently and in high capacity, you're going to struggle with them. But at the same time, it's like, okay, you're not unfit. Like, your slightly lower ability in this one movement doesn't change anything about your overall fitness level. And there's always going to be things that come up, whether it's quarterfinals, semifinals, games that you've never done before or you haven't done enough. Thinking back to the handstand ramp walk when they brought it into regionals, and I want to say regionals first year was 2018, maybe 17. And there was, again, definite split in the field. There was people that had done it a lot and were great at it. There was people who had never really considered that it was going to be there and struggled with it. And I think keeping that bigger picture in mind, and for people coming out of the Open this year who haven't finished where they want to, it's like, okay, well, what's your goal here? Your goal wasn't to win the Open. Your goal wasn't to have your best Open finish ever. Your goal was to make semifinals or make the games. So you got to be okay, and you got to be able to mentally move on from that and understand that your finish comparative to other years isn't a reflection on your current ability. It's a reflection on where you're trying to get to and your goals. And even for some people, they might finish, for those people that qualified for semifinals last year or for the games last year, they might finish lower in quarterfinals than they did last year. And that's okay. Again, if that's not their goal, if their goal is not to finish as high as possible in quarterfinals, you do what you need to do to get through on the understanding that you're preparing for something bigger.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky balance to find, right? That the big picture goal should continue to be whatever it is, doing well in quarterfinals, doing well in semifinals, doing well in the games, and then getting too caught up in your performance in a specific stage along the way is not beneficial, right? And I think if we take that to an adjacent sport like track and field or swimming or whatever, that you certainly see athletes, I think, being better at handling those kinds of things because they're just kind of doing the same race over and over and over again. And I think that athletes in some of those sports are better equipped to recognize the potential like spread of times that they might run for a 5K. And it's like, I know that this is not going to be my all-time best 5K. And I know where I need to finish relative to the pack to qualify for the next stage. And I'm not trying to like necessarily win this race. I'm not trying to set a personal record. Like, I'm just trying to qualify for the next stage. And I think that there can be less attachment to that specific time for some of those athletes because they recognize like what the goal of each stage is. But that said, if we think about like the open workouts or the quarterfinals workouts or whatever, I think a lot of people were exposed on that deadlift workout, for example, right? And putting aside all the things of whether or not that's a smart workout to program for however many hundreds of thousands of people to do across the world, for competitors, sort of like you mentioned on the GHD sit-ups last year in the quarterfinals, right? It's like, okay, were you prepared to do 150 GHD sit-ups with 150 pistols, right? And it's like, oh, maybe I wasn't, and I think that 100 repetitions of 225, 155 deadlifts, most competitors, quote unquote, are going to be prepared to do 45 to 65 reps at that weight. But I don't know that many people were like actually at a functional volume of 100 reps in a single workout, and that's something where it's like, okay, like that's a data point. You struggled on that. We didn't necessarily train that level of functional volume leading into this. Now we know that that's kind of like on the table as something to be prepared for and something that's potentially a weakness if it does come up. So we do need to be aware that could happen. And that's a useful data point, right? But that isn't necessarily reflective of where you actually are on your path to your longer goal, right? It's like, okay, yeah, you ran this 5K qualifying event and your time wasn't exactly where you wanted it to be, but like you still comfortably made it to the next stage. Like that's okay.
Yeah.
Like that's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, how many times in the Olympics does someone break a world record in a qualifying heat? You know, like a big track and field or things like that, those big events. World records tend to get broken in the finals because that's when, you know, people are building to that, and that's when they're putting all their effort and focus into that one race. Everything else is a stepping stone to get there. And I think there can be something to be said of building that confidence across the season. But like you said, with that deadlift workout, for most good athletes, they can handle 100 deadlifts at 225, 155. And from what I saw in that workout, the workout for most good athletes was actually just about the burpees. You know, the deadlifts were fairly inconsequential. And if you're a good athlete, you know, most people are unbroken there, maybe breaking up the 9-10-9 with a quick drop in between. But for the most part, it's how high a pace on burpees can you sustain. And I think, again, it comes back around to what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? And if your achievement doesn't include the word open, then you need to be okay with just getting through to the next stage, regardless of what you've done. If you're training for that, if you're training to get to semifinals, if you're training to get to the games, your training has to represent the work that is going to be tested at that level. So if you're training to get to semifinals for the first time, it's okay, I have to be training for quarterfinals. I have to be training the movements that are going to come up there. You know, they release the equipment list. We know roughly what's going to be in there. We know there's probably going to be something heavy, maybe a max out test. There's probably going to be a repeat in some capacity. You know, there's a GHD, there's a rope, there's rings, probably going to see ring muscle ups, especially as there were no ring muscle ups in the open or quarterfinals last year. I feel like that's kind of a logical step. You know, you can train around that, and you can train specifically for that. And the open is a speed bump to that competition. You know, I finished 86% in the open for someone who has not trained consistently.
Humble brag.
I mean, it's more of a reflection of the field this year, which I think must have been pretty poor.
Displaying massive alpha male status.
I would have genuinely assumed that I was going to finish about 50th percentile, but yeah, I mean, like, you can be a decent athlete and get through to quarterfinals. I feel like I keep saying that, but you know, that end goal has to be your focus of your training, and how you taper towards that, and how you build towards that, and the movements you're doing, and the loading you're doing, and the kind of workouts you're doing. You know, if you're just trying to get to semifinals, it's like, okay, you don't need to be doing the sled work, the sandbag work, the running, the stuff that you might see at semifinals doesn't need to be your focus right now. Not to say it can't be useful and it doesn't have, you know, carry over into other areas, but right now you better be doing everything that's going to come up in quarterfinals. And you know, we're recording this between the open and quarterfinals. Individuals have like 9 days in between to get ready for it, and that's, you know, if you've been focused on the open and not on quarterfinals up to this stage, it's way too late. You can't throw in the kind of volume and consistency you need for this next stage in 10 days. You need to have been doing it from
and I think that
January.
Yeah, I think that short turnaround is interesting from like a coaching and programming perspective too, where, you know, what I did for my athletes who like pretty confident we're going to make it onto the next stage is like sort of tried to recreate a quarterfinal style series of tests utilizing the open workout as one of them, right? Because it's like, okay, you have to sort of roll right into this. So you have to be prepared to do, you know, some workout with preposterous GHD volume in a few weeks. So we have to be preparing you to do preposterous GHD volume in conjunction with like kind of a nasty conditioning workout. So I do think that was like an interesting coaching challenge to try to structure the training properly to prepare for that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are going to struggle with the balance of volume across this next kind of month, whether it's individual or team quarterfinals they're preparing for. I have a few people doing the individual quarterfinal, and so I gave them, the front half of the week this week as light days or moderate days, as opposed to a normal training day. And it's an understanding of, we're 9 days out. Like, you want to be training, but you've just come through the open. There is, even without making it a priority, there's an element of emotional and mental effort that goes into that you need to recover from, and the physical side of it as well. And you need to, it's something I talk to people about a lot. It's better to be 100% healthy and ready than it is to be at 100% of your capacity. There's no point trying to like cram in all this last minute training, thinking that, okay, if I can just do this, I'm going to be a little bit fitter. But then you come into the competition and you're at 90% capacity because you're a little bit burnt out. Like, you at 100% of your current capacity is better than 90% of a perceived ideal capacity. So,
John, so if you're talking to someone who is, let's say, struggling with their open performance, or like having a hard time zooming out and focusing on what the bigger picture goal is, what have you found to be effective ways to communicate that?
I think the main thing is to highlight the improvements since last year. So talking to an athlete yesterday who was, again, concerned about their open finish in relation to last year, and it's bringing up like bring it back to that GHD pistol rope climb workout, something that I wouldn't say they struggled with last year, but was definitely one of their lowest performances in comparison to the others. And looking back at that piece now, and it's like, okay, you would crush your time from last year on that. You would be way deeper into this workout because you've done the practice on all three of those movements combined and consistently, so that that if that kind of thing came up, it's no longer a concern. And to look at other things around that, like, okay, what have we focused on this last year? Whether it's been gymnastics volume or your aerobic capacity or your top end strength, whatever it is for that athlete, to then be able to say, well, you've made improvements in this area, and maybe you haven't improved on your strengths. If you're a very strong athlete, maybe your top end strength is similar to what it was last year, but the areas that you had as weaknesses last year have vastly improved, and that you're an overall better athlete than last year. And I'm never one to try and have people shy away from working on their strengths, because I think within competition, the way the scoring works, there's a value to winning workouts and finishing top 3 in workouts. And if you have an opportunity to do that, it's worth kind of pushing on that. But if you want to be a better athlete and finish better overall, you have to sacrifice somewhere to focus on other areas. And I think, keeping that big picture and keeping that end goal in mind of, this is what I'm training for. It doesn't matter what happens here because my training is based around this. And that's, for different people, that's going to be harder to accept and to stay with. But for some people, if they can really move past that, they're going to find themselves in a better position mentally going into quarterfinals, semifinals games.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart, is like sort of focusing on the tangible improvements that you actually know have happened in training, because the testing structure doesn't always necessarily reflect what someone has improved at, right? That the tests change every year and the structure of the tests change every year, which is like part of the fun of the sport, but it does make things, confusing and challenging to actually benchmark yourself. Not to dwell too much on my school stuff again, but I think there's a lot of analogies, especially in certain aspects of computer science stuff, right? So within a lot of algorithms courses, there's like a very tricky class of programming problems called dynamic programming, which sort of requires like having a really clever key insight of how to make a like seemingly messy problem like simple and solvable. And you can be really, really good at that kind of problem and in general do really, really well with having that insight and being able to solve it. And you can still just get something like on an exam or whatever, or it's often used in like coding interviews too, right? A lot of the top tech companies will give people difficult dynamic programming problems in technical interviews. And you can be fantastic at it and just get something where you're like, I have no clue. Like, I don't get this. I don't see how this works out into a solution. And I just have no insight. And again, it feels really, really bad because you're like, I thought I was good at this. What's wrong with me? And you can make a ton of improvement and still just get something that you're like, no idea. And so I think that can happen in these CrossFit workouts as well, right? Where it's like you improved at literally everything except the combination of GHD sit-ups, pistols, and rope climbs at that volume. Like everything else is better. Didn't see that one coming. Sorry. And that's challenging. It's hard.
That's the hard thing as a coach. You're trying to balance out all the things that could come up. And, I find myself looking at programming right now and I'm like, oh, have we worked this enough? Can we like cram a little bit of practice in to kind of finish out before the next test? There's always areas that you can improve on as a coach, as an athlete. There's always things you can be doing more of and things you can be trying to improve. And the reality is there's going to be something that comes up where you're not 100% ready and 100%. You don't have your best ability to be able to put a good score up, but trusting that you've improved overall is going to be important to have that confidence to go out there and compete.
Yeah, and this is something that I just thought of this as you were talking about that, is that how an athlete reacts to an unfavorable situation that they're not prepared for, I think in and of itself is a skill, right? And we talk about that in a bunch of the other podcasts where often our goal as coaches is to create situations that require athletes to improvise and adapt on the fly. And, you're going to get workouts where you're like, oh shit, like I haven't done this. I'm not prepared for this. This is more volume than I'm ready for. I know I don't like this combination of movements. Like, it's going to happen. And so maybe something to also consider is not just what is your performance in an absolute sense, especially if you get unlucky and get something where you're like, well, that was really not what I wanted to see. But how did you actually react to that in terms of your emotional state, in terms of your ability to attempt to get through the workout on the fly? Those things are less legible and like easy to measure. But I actually think it matters a lot. And you can see progress there, even if your actual performance is worse because you got a workout that was just like an absolute shit show for you.